Prison gangs are always an interesting subject to talk about, since they contain some of the craziest and toughest people out there. And the tougher the prison, the tougher the gang. And no prisons were as tough as the Russian gulags of the Soviet era. And despite being under one of the strictest totalitarian regimes in history, the gulags still had prison gangs. But while most prison gangs' biggest rival is usually another prison gang, that wasn't the case for the gulag gangs. Their biggest enemy was the government. They hated the government and they viewed anyone who helped the government as their enemy. So, when World War II rolled around and the Russian war machine needed fresh meat for the grinder and promised prisoners that if they served in the army, then after the war they would be released, many prisoners jumped at the chance, because the gulags were so bad that the literal Eastern Front was genuinely viewed as the better option. However, after the war, Stalin, being Stalin, went back on his promise and threw all of the convict soldiers back in the gulags. Convict soldiers who had just helped the government. And the rest of the prisoners were waiting for them. The Bitch Wars. Please leave a like and a comment on this video because it really helps me in the algorithm. But before we get started, this video is brought to you by Holzkern. Holzkern make watches, but not just any watches. They are a small family business based out of Austria that produce the highest quality watches and have been doing so since 2016, giving them years of experience. Their watches use materials directly from nature with as little processing as possible, and they have over 1,000 designs. I for one am someone that greatly respects nature, and I think it's good to get out in it as much as possible. Every Holzkern watch is a unique piece due to the grain, marbling and iridescence of the wood, stone and nacre. Another thing we can thank nature for. While Holzkern watches are made of natural materials, Holzkern understands that you must give back what you take in order to preserve our planet. So everything from production, packaging and delivery are designed to be as sustainable as possible. Holzkern is FSC certified and supports reforestation projects and various other projects that have environmental protection or social support in mind. A Holzkern watch is designed to remind you of the nature it came from, the connection you have with it, the uniqueness you or your other half share with it, and the importance of how to spend your precious time. It's also a really unique and sentimental gift that you can give to that special someone this Christmas, because it's not just something that you grabbed from the petrol station or Amazon. It's actually a very thoughtful present. Holzkern offers free express worldwide shipping and custom fees are on us. Holzkern guarantees delivery of all orders placed up until the 20th of December with free and easy returns until the middle of January. So, use code COUNT15 to get a unique Holzkern watch today, either for yourself or a loved one by clicking the link in the description box down below. During the Soviet era, there was a lot of pressure on Lenin to crack down on common crimes like theft and burglary. But his solution was just to simply have them all executed in droves by firing squad. Because communism. And you would think that this somewhat over-the-top response would deter criminals and lower the crime rate, but it really didn't have much of an overall effect. These are Russians we're talking about. Stalin, on the other hand, had other ideas. He thought, why waste good labour when instead we could put these guys to work as slaves in work camps to further his own goals of production and expansion. So they were put to work in the gulags, which many people would argue is a fate worse than death. There was a problem, however. During the Nazi invasion of Russia known as Operation Barbarossa, which started on June the 22nd, 1941, the Nazis were winning against the Russians, and they had captured Kiev, Minsk and Smolensk, all of them bordering major cities like Leningrad, Stalingrad and, of course, Moscow. The Russians lost so many soldiers in the conflict that they had to come up with other ways of replenishing their forces. So they decided to recruit more soldiers from the gulags. The military positions created for prisoners were called penal battalions. These battalions were absolutely brutal, and the inmates turned soldiers were just treated as meat shields to be put on the front lines, with very little clear objectives. So most of the soldiers didn't even know what they were doing half of the time, and they were often just ordered to charge at the enemy when they were at an obvious disadvantage. Like sending wee Sergei to take on a tank all by himself, where inevitably wee Sergei would be turned into red mist. Their reward for serving in the military would be a full pardon for all of their crimes and immediate release from the gulags once the war was over. But these convict soldiers were tough. The already hardened and rugged inmates were tortured with brutally hard labour, in the same gulags as Russia's political and ideological enemies. Now, I know that most of you are already aware of what happened in the gulags, but for those of you who don't know much about it, I'll go through it anyway. Gulag work often involved felling timber, mining or construction projects such as working on the railroads, motorways, dams and canals. All of which was absolutely grueling work in the freezing cold, and safety protocols were pretty much completely disregarded, non-existent essentially. So there were a lot of accidents and a lot of deaths. And you worked for as long as you were told to, on pretty much no food. If you refused to work or you stopped working, the punishments would be very harsh. Most of the time, death was too easy and there was no logic in killing a tool, because that is all you were in the gulags. Not a human, not a man, a tool. Less valuable than even a farm animal. If you acted out of line, the punishments were very severe, but you would live to regret it. You would be completely, absolutely brutalised by the guards, and then the very next day, broken bones or not, you would be put straight back to work. On the rare occasions that the prisoners did have some time outside of work, they never had any privacy, and they were very often surrounded by people who were suffering from either being beaten and starved, or they were plagued with diseases. They would get severe frostbite from the cold and dysentery from the lack of quality drinking water, scurvy from the lack of nutrition, and other things such as typhus, tuberculosis, and malaria. The barracks were overcrowded and absolutely filthy beyond belief, and in the morning you usually had to dispose of the bodies of everyone who had died during the night. On top of that, the heating was very, very poor to non-existent. So the only option was to huddle together for body warmth, which was the perfect conditions for diseases to spread. People would also have complete mental breakdowns because of all of the suffering they were going through. Conditions were so bad that prisoners would actually kill each other over the smallest piece of mouldy bread. Surrounding the barracks were high fences topped with rusted masses of barbed wire and watchtowers on each corner where armed guards would be on constant watch. Many people tried to escape anyway, and they were pretty much always killed. Since conditions in the gulags were so bad, many people still saw a most likely fatal escape attempt as a much better alternative to spending one more day in this hell. As for how the prisoners were fed, one of the most common dishes that was served to the gulag inmates was a thin soup known as balanda, which has been described exactly as it sounds. Bland. It was essentially boiled soya, and it formed this grey, disgusting looking broth. The beans would remain at the bottom of the boiling pot, which was served differently depending on your post. Average prisoners would have their balanda ladled from the top, which was mostly just grey water. Whereas, if the cook deemed you a worthy or notable person in the gulag, he would ladle it from the bottom of the pot, which was thicker and more nourishing. Well, as nourishing as boiled soya could be. Thankfully, the prisoners did have access to bread, but it wasn't good bread. It was mostly just leftovers, and it was mostly always rotten. But this bread was a lifeline for many of the inmates, because even though it was disgusting and rotten, eating this could give the inmates some actual energy. So, the conditions in the gulags were absolutely horrendous. It was a hell on earth that some people had to endure for the tiniest infractions, like stealing a loaf of bread or for saying the wrong thing about the government. So this, of course, made a lot of the prisoners have an absolute undying hatred of the government and all those who served it. Prisoners all had this agreement with each other to never work for the government and never do anything that benefits the government. And anyone who does is the enemy. And that mindset was so strong that it actually still exists in Russian prisons to this day. So when the military came into the gulags to find people that wanted to go to the front lines in exchange for a pardon, because of this mindset, the majority of the prisoners told them to fuck off. But there were some prisoners who accepted the offer. They were going to serve the government in exchange for a pardon. And these prisoners were viewed as traitors and immediately became hated by everyone in the gulag. But don't worry, they'll be absolutely fine. They're getting a pardon, so it's not like they're going to be coming back to the gulag. So they don't need to worry about the other prisoners. Well, fate can have a really funny way of completely fucking you over. The small number of people that had took the offer of military service and had somehow survived, got their pardons and were released from the gulags, very often ended up getting sent back to the gulags because they went straight back to a life of crime. And those were just the lucky ones. Some of the other prisoners who had accepted the offer were completely lied to, and they never received any kind of pardon. As soon as the war was over, they were just sent straight back to the gulag. So, most of these traitors were now back in the gulags, where the other prisoners were waiting for them. Those who had served and were sent back to the gulags were referred to by the other prisoners as the Suki, and they were treated very, very harshly by the other prisoners because they had gone against the criminal code and worked with the authorities. So the Suki decided to gang together for protection and started to collaborate with the prison guards since they were now outsiders. But collaborating with the guards only made the other prisoners hate them even more. They did this in order to survive, and also to get some of the easier jobs in the camp, since the jobs that they normally did broke their backs and their spirits, to the point of dying due to extreme exhaustion, which was probably seen as a better alternative than living as a husk. But getting the easier jobs only made the other prisoners hate them yet again even more. Now, those who survived the military were some of the toughest motherfuckers to return because these guys had survived the Eastern Front, which was no easy task, so these guys could really handle themselves. But in the gulags, they were seriously outnumbered. Also, for those of you who don't play Rust or CSGO, in Russian, Suki or Suka means bitch, which had a much more negative connotation to Russian criminals in comparison to the English equivalent. In Russian criminal slang, it specifically refers to a criminal who has cooperated with law enforcement or the government. It basically means that someone has willingly made themselves a bitch, become a snitch, or backstabbed their fellow inmates. So, with all of this hatred towards the bitches, the other prisoners just started murdering them left, right and centre. It was a very common thing to wake up in the morning to find a few dead, stabbed up bitches in the barracks somewhere who had all been murdered during the night. Or walking to the canteen during the day and finding some murdered bitch lying in a corner somewhere. And prison authorities turned a blind eye to it since prisoner deaths reduced the overall prison population and also reduced the number of criminals that might return to the street. Also, less prisoners means less work for the guards to do. And let's be very honest, Gulag guards aren't exactly known for their care or compassion. But while there were many criminals in the gulags who had committed common, actual crimes, they were still a minority in the prison population, because the overwhelming majority of the prison population were people convicted of counter-revolutionary agitation. Or, simply put, they just didn't agree with what the government was doing. So, the vast majority of people that were in the gulags were just regular, everyday people that unfortunately said the wrong thing when the wrong person was listening. But, despite actual genuine criminals only making up 2.7% of the overall gulag population, they committed the vast majority of the crimes in the gulag. They often had a very big influence over the other prisoners, usually involving them in their illegal schemes, since these guys, being actual, trained professional criminals, were a lot more organised. Now, the criminal code that I mentioned earlier was part of the Vori v Zakonie, or Thieves in the Law, which I'll refer to now as the Vori. They were a group of criminals who had to follow their very own, very strict code. Some of the rules were to forsake your biological relatives in favour of your new brothers in the gang, never work in any capacity for the government, and always get by via means of theft, which they used as an umbrella term for all crimes except for sex crimes, which were very massively looked down upon and usually punished pretty harshly. A Vori was bound to help other thieves when asked, never join the military or any other authority, and to take the blame for other thieves' crimes, but only if there was no other choice. And of course, snitches get stitches. They had very many rules in their code, but it was essentially a thieves' guild. Look after each other, do crime, make money. They even had their own dialect of Russian called Fenya, so that they could communicate with each other in code. They even had their own legal system and court hearings, and the punishments were rather fucking harsh for anyone who went against the code. Some of the sentences involved being strangled to death or killed with an axe, among many other very gruesome ends. Smaller crimes would result in you losing a few digits, a hand, or even a whole arm, which was sometimes self-inflicted by some prisoners to get out of certain duties. The Vori, who had enlisted for a pardon, believed that they would just be welcomed back into the criminal society by their fellow inmates. But they had broken a pretty fucking major rule in the code by joining the military and serving the government. So, instead of open arms, the Vori that hadn't enlisted shunned them, and essentially wanted them dead. As far as they were concerned, these guys were traitors and no longer part of the group. So even though there were several factions in the gulags, from career criminals and gangsters to just regular everyday people who were political dissidents, all of them hated the Suki. And some of the Suki at one point had belonged to these very same factions. The Gulag authorities actually noticed this rift between all of these groups, and they believed that they could turn the expelled thieves into useful workers. So the Suki started to be given special treatment, such as less work, less intensive work, more food, and sometimes even different meals and positions of authority. The guards maybe thought that since the Suki had served the government, that they were kind of on side. So, if the guards had control of a group of prisoners, that would make the guards' lives even easier. This, however, just caused even more envy and hatred from the Vori and the other prisoners, which only increased the violence. This did make the other prisoners a little bit more cautious about doing anything to the Suki, since the Suki now kind of had the guards' backing. But in order for the authorities to mould the Suki into good little government stooges and snitches, they would use both positive and negative tactics. If any of the Suki didn't listen to orders or acted belligerently towards the guards, then they would be beaten almost to death, which would break their will. Some of the Suki that were perceived as being weak were also just beaten anyway and very often ended up dead. And that was just by the guards. If the Vori or some other desperate prisoner sensed any weakness in you, then you were in a lot of trouble. The guards even used the Suki as hitmen. If there was some criminal element in the Gulag that seemed to have a lot of power, or a certain prisoner was causing too many problems for the guards would send in one or even multiple Suki, even helping the Suki by unlocking the target's cell door while they were sleeping. The method of death was very often just whatever was on hand, and that could have been anything from being beaten to death, clubbed, shanked, or worse, hacked up with an axe. Some of the inmates even used shovels, bricks, and rocks. In Leningrad, some of the gulags actually had daily battles between the two factions, and in one instance, a Vori was actually found in solitary confinement with his eyes gouged out and his organs spilling out of his stomach. As I mentioned before, however, the guards really didn't care much at all about the prisoners. But since the Suki were willing to go against their original code, while most other prisoners would only do the minimum amount of work necessary to not catch a beating, the Suki would do some actual work. This meant that the prison guards could hit their work quotas, which overall would make their lives much easier. Guards very often had to encourage the prisoners to hit their work quotas, because if the work quotas weren't met, the guards were the ones who got punished. The guards also had to live in the gulags as well, so they weren't really living in conditions all that much better than the inmates. Prisoners on both sides would prey on the general population, and sometimes bribe guards to look the other way. That's if they even needed to bribe the prison guards, since guards would just allow absolutely horrible shit to happen to you if they didn't like you. They would do horrific things to other prisoners in order to get by, and that didn't always mean outright killing them. They would sometimes just torture anyone that appeared weak to break them down mentally in order to extort them for something later on. Gang-affiliated tattoos are not uncommon in prisons these days, and the Gulag wasn't much different. Tattoos could literally show a person's power level, like their rank in the gang and the story of their criminal achievements. Many of the prisoners had tattoos with symbolism of the kind of crimes they specialised in. And then there were the forced tattoos, which were seen by other prisoners as a pretty big demotion. Prisoners with tattoos depicting sex acts were often known to be sexual predators, and of course were massively looked down upon by other prisoners, and just like in modern day prisons, it would paint a target on their back and they were usually beaten or murdered as a result. Other tattoos were applied to lower the opinion of someone without having to know them, such as people that owed debts or had scammed others or had failed to honour a bet after losing a card game. So those people might receive a tattoo of a stool pigeon. Some prisoners had a portrait of Stalin or Lenin tattooed on their body. And you might be thinking, why would they get tattoos like that if they hated the government so much? Well, that was because defacing the images of the dear leaders was punishable by death, meaning prison guards would be very, very reluctant to beat or kill prisoners who had those tattoos. If someone was seen to be doing deals involving an inmate with these kinds of tattoos, then they were perceived as being corrupted because they were dealing with an outcast. In fact, the Suki were sometimes held down forcefully and had Suka tattooed onto their foreheads. So, if you were seen shaking hands with an untouchable, you would become one yourself. There is a black and white picture of a forced tattoo of a Russian prisoner with the word Suka tattooed on his face, and I know for a fact I've seen this picture. I've talked to other people who have also seen that picture, but for the life of me, I cannot find it anywhere. So either this picture is really hard to find, or I'm having a touch of the Mandela effect. As time went on, however, the bitches were actually starting to win the war, due to them having help from the guards and being seen as more productive citizens. So, the population of the Vori dropped drastically since they were all being killed off. The Vori had to plan their killings and attacks around the guards so that they wouldn't get caught. But with the bitches, the guards were actually helping them with their killings and attacks. So, despite being very, very outnumbered, this gave the bitches a massive advantage. However, the bitch wars slowly winded down around the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953, as the Gulag's overall population shrank dramatically since the majority of inmates were political or ideological prisoners who were freed pretty quickly after Stalin's death. The Gulags had pretty much all closed by 1960, and Russia started to instead opt for regular prisons like everyone else was using. Russia calmed down a lot after Stalin's death. I mean, it was still really, really fucking bad, but it had calmed down a little bit. But now that the Gulags were closed, this meant that all of these battle-hardened murdering criminals were now out on the streets. So the Suki ended up forming gangs outside of the prison, but this time they were not bound by any kind of code. Part of being a Suki was you basically had abandoned the code. They also embedded themselves into what might have appeared as legitimate businesses, but they weren't really. They were able to make a lot of money and had reached power and numbers they never had before. Though they eventually did return to some kind of criminal code, among other criminals, the Suki were the most hated kind of criminals. Other criminals did not like them and did not want to work with them. But then, in the 90s, when the Iron Curtain fell and the Russian mafia absolutely exploded in power, the Suki kind of fell by the wayside. Mostly because the Russian mafia dominated absolutely fucking everything and they did not want to work with the Suki, so the Suki either just faded away into irrelevance or they all got murdered by the Russian mafia. So, moral of the story, don't be a bitch.
It's Count Dankula on YouTube. Everybody just subscribe.